Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face?
All right, let's get started here. Or pause. I'll be right back. All right, sorry about that. I am back. Oh, not that one. That one. Here we go. Okay. So, get lined out here and actually get started. Um, so, we are going to start in on The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture by David Bryan Davis. This is, as far as I can tell, the dates are not very clear inside. The cover art is the 1988 cover art, so I'm assuming that's when this printing is. Um, Originally written in 1966, Pulitzer Prize winner for 67. Um, it's going to be fairly dense. The writing is pretty small, so I'm going to just jump straight into chapter 1 and skip the introduction that talked about why he decided to write the book to begin with. And just get into it. Here we go. Get into it. Here we go. Get into it. Okay. Chapter 1: The Historical Problem, Slavery and the Meaning of America. Americans have often been embarrassed when reminded that the Declaration of Independence was written by a slaveholder and that Negro slavery was, remember, this was written in 1966, so don't get all bent out of shape because he uses the word Negro. He might use other words too. I'm going to read it as he fucking wrote it. So if you're offended by that, leave. Um, Americans are often have often been embarrassed when reminded that the Declaration of Independence was written by a slaveholder and that Negro slavery was a legal institution in all 13 colonies at the beginning of the Revolution. How is it, asked Samuel Johnson, this is a quote, how is it, asked Samuel Johnson, that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? The inconsistency was not overlooked. End quote. Sorry. The inconsistency was not overlooked by American Tories who exhibited it as proof of the rebels' hypocrisy. Even English liberals who sympathized with the revolution were disturbed by a conception of liberty that seemed to exclude the Negro race. During the struggle with Great Britain, American leaders often admitted that slavery was contrary to the principles for which they fought, and a number of reformers warned that the revolution could be justified only by a decision to rid the land of slavery. In 1775, for example, Deacon Benjamin Coleman noted that Boston, the first slave trading port on the continent, had, had been the first victim of British oppression, a remarkable providence which clearly indicated that Massachusetts could not secure her own freedom until she emancipated her slaves. And toward the end of the war, David Cooper observed that, quote, our rulers have appointed days for humiliation and offering up of prayer to our common Father to deliver us from our oppressors when sighs and groans are piercing piercing his holy ears, from oppression which we commit a thousandfold more grievous. End quote. But the irony of slaveholders fighting for the natural rights of man was only part of a larger paradox which has seldom been grasped in its full dimensions. The anti-slavery arguments of the Revolutionary period were often grounded upon a belief in America as a liberating and regenerating force, as the world's new hope. This belief had taken various forms and had only recently been directed against slavery, but from the time of the first discoveries, Europeans had projected ancient visions of liberation and perfection into the vacant spaces of the New World. Explorers approached the uncharted coasts of the vague preconceptions of mythical Atlantis, Antilia, and the Brendan Isles. The naked savages, living in apparent freedom and innocence, awakened memories of terrestrial paradise and the golden age described by the ancients. Even the practical minded Columbus fell under the spell of the gentle natives on the Gulf of Paria, who were who wore golden ornaments and lived in a land of lush vegetation and delicious fruits. He concluded in August 1498 that he had arrived on the nipple of the earth, which reached closer to heaven than the rest of the globe, and that the original Garden of Eden was nearby. 17 years later, when Sir Thomas More began writing Utopia, he naturally chose the Western Hemisphere as his setting. Ooh, there are tons of footnotes at the bottom, which I will not read unless somebody specifically asks me to. Columbus's successors pursued elusive visions of golden cities and fountains of youth. Their native God, this writing is so small. Their narratives revived and nourished the utopian dreams of Europe. From antiquity, Western thought had been predisposed to look to nature for the universal norms of human life. Since nature carried connotations of origin and birth, as well as of intrinsic character, philosophers often associated valid norms with what was original in man's primeval state. They contrasted the restraints, prejudices, and corrupting tastes of civilized life with either a former age of virtue or a simpler, more primitive state of society. Many of the explorers and early commentators on America drew upon this philosophic tradition. In the New World, they found an Elysium to serve as a standard for criticizing the perverted manners of Europe. Catholic missionaries, being dedicated to ideals of renunciation and asceticism, saw much to admire in the simple contentments of the Indians, whose mode of living seemed to resemble that of the first Christians. As Gilbert Chenard has pointed out, the voyageurs and Jesuit priests who compared the evils of Europe with the freedom, equality, and felicitous life of the American savages contributed unwittingly to the revolutionary philosophy of the 18th century. Some writers, to be sure, described the Indians as inferior degenerates or as Satan's children, and presented a contrary image of America as an insalubrious desert. Antonello Gerbi has documented the long dispute over the nature of the New World. Oh, great. It's in Latin. I think that's Latin. Mondo nascente o neonato, mondo deserto e misero. Howard Mumford Jones has recently, it doesn't translate it. I'm going to guess something. I'm not going to guess. If anybody knows Latin, tell me in the comments what that means. Howard Mumford Jones was recently shown that America was conceived at once as an idyllic Arcadia and as a land of cannibalism, torture, and brutality, where extremities of human greed and cruelty were matched by the unexpected terrors and monstrosities of the wilderness. But in Hebrew and Christian thought, the idea of wilderness had long been linked with rebirth and fulfillment. After being delivered from slavery in Egypt, the children of Israel had crossed the Red Sea and had wandered in the wilderness for 40 years before finding the Promised Land. The desert was a place of refuge and purification, of suffering and perseverance, and no matter what hardships it offered, there was the assurance that a fertile paradise would ultimately emerge from its desolate wastes. Thanks to the researches of George H. Williams, we know what an important part such imagery played in Christian ideas of redemption. The wilderness might be thought of as a purely spiritual state, or as the abode of monks, hermits, and persecuted sects. But early American colonists could hardly escape the symbolic implications of a baptismal crossing of the Atlantic, or of dwelling in a land which could be seen as either desert or primeval garden. The New World, like the wilderness in both the Old and New Testaments, was a place of extraordinary temptation, obligation, and promise. While a growing literature celebrated America as a symbol of nature, free from the avarice, luxury, and materialism of Europe, promoters and colonizers saw the virgin land as a place for solving problems and satisfying desires. This was true of the conquistadors who tried to recreate the age of chivalric romance. It was true of the Jesuits who followed Manuel de Nobrega to Brazil, determined to purify morals and spread the faith. It was true of the English Puritans who sought to build a new Jerusalem as a model of piety for the rest of the world. It was true of the drifters and the ne'er-do-wells, the bankrupts and sleazy gentlemen who fluttered to the new world like moths drawn to a light. In America, things would be better, for America was the promised land. It could be said, of course, that America was an asylum for scoundrels, adventurers, and religious fanatics, but in time much of the magic of the virgin continent seemed to rub off on its conquerors. French humanitarians, for example, found it easy to shift their enthusiasm from noble savage to peace-loving Quaker. In Saint John de Crevecoeur, uh, Crevecoeur's letter from, uh, sorry, it's a title, Letters from an American Farmer, we see perhaps the clearest picture of American ideal. A skillful weaving together of primitivist, pastoral, and democratic themes. The portrayal of a land in which individual opportunity and social progress are somehow merged with the simple, self-denying virtues of Seneca and Virgil. This long tradition, based on a mixture of biblical and classical sources, helped to shape the American's image of himself as the new Adam of the West, a being unencumbered by the fears and superstitions of a moldering civilization, a wise innocent dwelling in a terrestrial paradise. He was at once the happy husbandman, content to enjoy the serene blessings of a simple rural life, and an adventurous pioneer, expansive and supremely confident of his ability to improve the world. Such an image contained an intrinsic contradiction which contributed to severe tensions in the face of rapid social and economic change. But if Americans were often inclined to see Satan fast at work corrupting their new Eden, this only enhanced the moral importance of their mission, and by the time of the Revolution many European liberals looked to America as the hope of mankind, for it was there that institutions seemed most clearly modeled on nature's simple plan. By reconciling nature and human progress, the newly independent states appeared to have fulfilled the ancient dream of a more perfect society. But what was the meaning of slavery in an earthly paradise? By the time of Columbus, involuntary servitude had begun to disappear through much of Western Europe. 2 centuries before the discovery of America, Philip the Fair had written in an ordinance freeing the serfs of Valois. Attendu, it's in French. I am gonna just butcher the hell out of that. Um, I am not even gonna try it. I will just butcher the hell out of it. But he wrote something. Henry the Seventh of England was said to have manumitted some of the villains on his estates. Um, quote, because in the beginning nature made all men free, and afterwards the law of nations reduced some under the yoke of servitude, end quote. Yet slavery had been linked from the very beginning with what Edmundo O'Gorman has called, quote, the invention of America, end quote. The African voyages promoted by Prince Henry of Portugal prepared the way for the first crossing of the Atlantic, and when Columbus arrived in Lisbon in 1477, the trade in Negro slaves was a flourishing enterprise. The same Columbus who identified the Gulf of Paria as the gateway to the Garden of Eden, had no compunction about sending hundreds of Indians to be sold in the slave marts of Seville, although some 200 died on the first voyage and had to be thrown into the sea. It was thus the discoverer of America who initiated the transatlantic slave trade, which moved originally from west to east. It was soon apparent, however, as the Spanish came close to exterminating the native inhabitants of Hispaniola, that successful colonization would require a fresh supply of laborers. Negro slaves arrived in the New World at least as early as 1502, and by 1513 the sale of licenses for importing Negroes was a source of profit for the Spanish government. Following the Guinea current and trade winds, Portuguese ships provided the colonists with a mounting supply of slaves, but seldom with enough to meet the insatiable demand. As Negro labor became indispensable for Spanish and then Portuguese colonization, European traders and African chieftains slowly built a vast commercial system, which brought a profound transformation in African culture and stunted the growth of other commerce between Europe and the Dark Continent. For 3.5 centuries, the principal maritime powers competed with one another in the lucrative slave trade and carried nearly 10 million Africans to the New World. Historians have long been inclined to regard this vast movement of population as an unfortunate but relatively minor incident in American history. Interest in national and sectional history has often obscured the significance of Negro slavery in the overall development of the Americas. But if the institution was of little economic importance in Massachusetts or Nova Scotia, it nevertheless extended from Rio de la Plata to the St. Lawrence, and was the basic system of labor in the colonies most valued by Europe. In the most profitable colonies, Negro slaves were employed in mines and in clearing virgin land, or on the great plantations which provided Europe with sugar, rice, tobacco, cotton, and indigo. The northern colonies that were unsuited for the production of staple crops became dependent early in their history on supplying the slave colonies with goods and provisions of various kinds. As a stimulus to shipbuilding, insurance, investment, and banking, the slave trade expanded employment in a diversity of occupations and encouraged the growth of seaports on both sides of the Atlantic. Africa became a prized market for iron, textiles, firearms, rum, and brandy. Investments in the triangular trade brought dazzling rewards, since profits could be made in exporting consumer goods to Africa, in selling slaves to planters, and especially in transporting sugar and other staples to Europe. By the 1760s, a large number of the wealthy merchants in Britain and France were connected in some way with the West Indian trade. The capital accumulation from investment in slaves and their produce helped to finance the building of canals, factories, and railroads. Even after the United States had achieved independence and a more diversified economy, her principal export was slave grown cotton, which was the chief raw material for the Industrial Revolution. Without exaggerating the economic significance of Negro slavery, we may safely conclude that it played a major role in the early development of the New World and in the growth of commercial capitalism. Given the lack of an alternative labor supply, it is difficult to see how European nations could have settled America and exploited its resources without the aid of African slaves. Yet slavery had always been more than an economic institution. In Western culture, it had long represented the ultimate limit of dehumanization, of treating and regarding a man as a thing. How was one to reconcile the brute fact that slavery was an intrinsic part of the American experience with the image of the New World as uncorrupted nature, as a source of redemption from the burdens of history, as a paradise which promised fulfillment of man's highest aspirations? For more than 2 centuries, this momentous question was generally ignored. Missionaries and travelers such as Jean-Baptiste de Tertre, who celebrated the virtues of the American Indian and portrayed the New World as a second Eden, were indifferent to the predicament of the African slave. A double standard in judging Negroes and Indians enabled colonists of various nationalities to channel moral concern toward the aborigine, whose freedom was often essential for commercial and military security, and to screen off the critical center of the American dilemma. Yet, protests against the dispossession and exploitation of innocent Indians often implied that America's promise could not be realized without a price of guilt, and in popular literature at least, the distinction between Indians and Negroes had a tendency to dissolve. The tale of Incal and Yarico was one of the first portrayals of American moral experience to attract popular interest on an international scale. Translated into 8 languages, this great folk epic inspired some 40 separate works during the 18th century and was given form in poems, essays, plays, and ballet. The story may be interpreted as merely an early outburst of middle class sentimentality, but it may also be taken as the first significant attempt to give imaginative expression to the meaning of slavery in America. In 1657, Richard Ligon told of an Indian woman in Barbados who had been a slave in the house where he had lived. She had been sold by a quote unquote Christian servant who had brought her from the mainland where he had been shipwrecked. The lovely maiden had actually saved the Christian's life, had fallen in love with him, and had cared for him in a secluded cave. After becoming pregnant, she had accompanied her lover to Barbados, only to be betrayed. Quote, and so poor Eureka for her love lost her liberty. End quote. This was the nucleus of the story used by Sir Richard Steele's Arietta to prove that women are more faithful than men. But Steele, writing in 1711, gave a softer and more sentimental picture of primitive life in America. After being saved by the innocent Eureka, Thomas Incal, a young English sailor, enjoys an idyllic honeymoon in an Eden-like setting. The couple sport together in moonlit groves, and Eureka brings tropical fruit to their remote cave and plays with Incal's curly hair while the nightingales sing. Incal, however, is an ambitious young man who could never be content to waste his life in such a paradise. When he promises to take Eureka to England and to clothe her in fine silks, she signals a ship which eventually carries the couple to Barbados. Regretting the time and profits he has lost, Incal, who is a quote, prudent and frugal young man, end quote, decides to sell his mistress as a slave. When he learns that Eureka is pregnant, he simply raises her price. Steele obviously wished to dramatize the evils of ingratitude and infidelity. For this purpose, he chose an exotic setting and a primitivistic scale of values, contrasting the selfishness and cunning of the European with the spontaneous virtues of the American savage. Neither Ligon nor Steele questioned the institution of slavery. The nature of Eureka's misfortune was less important than the fact that she had been spiritually free in a state of nature, whereas Incal had remained a slave to avarice and ambition. Steele's imitators, however, increasingly dwelt on the cruelty and injustice of selling human beings. In an anonymous poem of 1736, Barbados is, quote, the sad place where sorrow ever reigns, and hopeless wretches groan beneath their chains. End quote. The New World is at once a terrestrial paradise where a European may escape the buffetings of a tempestuous world and enjoy an idyllic love in the state of nature, and it is the scene of heartless exploitation where men disregard the elemental ties of humanity and sell their fellow creatures into perpetual bondage. By 1734, moreover, Eureka has become a Negro virgin, and by the middle of the century, the story's setting is expanded to include Africa and Jamaica. It is possible that the pathetic figure of Eureka helped to stimulate a general sympathy for American slaves. The tale was eventually appropriated by anti-slavery writers such as the Abbé Raynal, but the fact remains that the betrayed girl was usually portrayed as an Indian. If the thematic materials of the story provided a means of conceptualizing America's contradiction in timeless categories of nature and civilization, love and betrayal, innocent contentment and mean ambition, they also raised moral questions which 18th century writers found easier to evade than explore. By 1787, when George Colman the Younger built an opera on the plot of Inkle and Eureka, the tale had become little more than farce and ephemeral entertainment. As we shall see, wow, as we shall see in the subsequent chapters, the legal and moral validity of slavery was a troublesome question in European thought from the time of Aristotle to the time of Locke. It was only in the 18th century, however, that discussions of American slavery acquired a prominent place in the standard works of history, jurisprudence, political economy, and moral philosophy, firmly established by Montesquieu, Francis Hutcheson, William Robertson, Blackstone, Adam Smith, and Jefferson. The convention was sustained by leading thinkers of the 19th century. For as the Western mind increasingly looked to history for moral guidance and self-understanding, it became imperative to reconcile the revival of slavery in modern times with various theories of human progress. Disciples of the Enlightenment, for example, might well ask why the institution had continued to flourish in an age of reason and improved understanding of natural law. In the 19th century, the persistence of slavery took on new implications as men identified progress with a widening influence of Christian morality, of social science, or of popular democracy. Since these four views of progress long governed the dominant interpretations of slavery in modern history, and since they reveal somewhat different contours of the problem, it is well to examine four works which are representative of each perspective. In the Abbé Raynal, we may see an example of the Enlightenment's faith in reason and nature. Henri Alexandre Wallin and Auguste Comte may stand respectively for belief in the progress of Christian and scientific principles. For an exponent of popular democracy, we may turn to George Bancroft. The Abbé Raynal and his distinguished collaborators, who in 1770 brought out the first edition of the Histoire des deux Indies, uh, the history of the two Indies, um, assumed that the discovery and colonization of America had profoundly influenced the history of the world and all aspects of European civilization. The great question was whether this influence has furthered human progress or had only brought more rapid changes. Slavery quite obviously could not be excluded from so momentous an evaluation. Like most philosophies of this age, Raynal thought that slavery was contrary to nature and thus universally wrong. He conceded to be sure that dependence and authority were necessary as man progressed from the most primitive state of equality. What was more difficult to explain was why a mild domestic slavery had developed into a more brutal system that had spread throughout the ancient world as wealth, power, and enlightenment had increased. Reynal did not attempt to resolve this paradox, as some historians had done by reference to the more moral depravity of the pagan religions. While seeing slavery as evidence of man's greed and selfishness, he indicated that its worst evils had been aggravated by the growth of complex civilizations. To Montesquieu's belief that Christianity had ultimately abolished slavery in Europe, he gave no credence. In the gradual emancipation of European slaves, or if the gradual emancipation of European slaves had produced a more felicitous society, the result should be attributed not to religion, which had done nothing to promote human liberty, but to the political and economic self-interest of kings who had sought to lessen the power of great lords. Raynal did not explain why material progress seemed at times to encourage slavery, as in the ancient world, and at other times to destroy it, as in the late Middle Ages. Like many thinkers of his century, he simply assumed a sharp distinction between an unnatural hunger for gold and luxury, which corrupted society and enslaved whole peoples, and a natural expression of self-interest, which led to freedom and genuine wealth. In any event, domestic liberty was scarcely born in Europe when it was buried in America. In Raynal's eyes, European expansion into the New World was characterized from the beginning by unbelievable cruelty, slaughter, and despotic slavery. Far from bringing a message of hope and redemption, America provided an unlimited field for the exploitation of man's fellow beings. Although European morals had progressed in the Age of Enlightenment, the slave trade in America gave a constant stimulus to the worst vices and passions of mankind. Was this a necessary outcome of America's development? Since Raynal believed that slavery was utterly repugnant to nature, he could not easily accept its historical inevitability. He fixed the blame for initiating the French and British slave trade on pirates and freebooters whose insatiable greed had led them step by step to the cultivation of sugar and the devastation of Africa. Presumably, if the nations of Europe had understood their true interests and the laws of economics, the history of the New World might have taken a happier course. Yet it had been the initial voyages to America that had unsettled the European imagination and had produced a new breed of men who, at the expense of health, virtue, and ancestral ties, were always roving in search of wealth. If most of the European nations had become stained with the guilt of trading, it was America that had led them astray. Nor could Raynal really believe that the tropical and semi-tropical colonies could have been cultivated without slaves. In the first two editions of his work, he made a surprising compromise when he objected to the original prohibition against slaves in Georgia as an "oppression," which prevented the growth of the colony. Somewhat modifying this view in the edition of 1781, he concluded nevertheless that the question of allowing slaves in Georgia should have been decided by asking whether they were required for the better cultivation of land or for the greater security of property. The answer to this question must have been clear to Raynal's mind, since he had already claimed that South Carolina was the richest of the continental colonies and would soon double her population and produce if she were able to beat out the French and Spanish in the markets of the world. As he summed up his thoughts toward the end of the 10th volume, Raynal blurted out rhetorically, "But without this labor, these lands, acquired at such a high cost, would remain uncultivated." To this, his only reply as a committed enemy of bondage was a flourish of despair. "When then let them lie fallow. Well then, let them fly. Sorry. Quote. Well then, let them lie fallow if it means that To make these lands productive, man must be reduced to brutishness, whether he be the man who buys, or he who sells, or he who is sold. End quote. But though Reynal recognized that slavery was intimately connected with the very meaning of America, he did not abandon the traditional ideas of the land of promise. The inhabitants of the New World, though corrupted by slavery, had an opportunity to create a new society based on the principles of reason and nature. If they should succeed one day in throwing off the evil that enveloped them, they might become a great race, enriched by a mixture of diverse peoples, united in their predictions, their sorry, united in their dedication to liberty, science, and humanity. After having been devastated by Europe, the new world would rise to greatness and liberate the rest of mankind from enslaving customs and institutions. Okay. Um, there is a good breaking point here. I am going to actually get to that and then take a quick break, because my eyes are going buggy with this tiny, um, tiny script. Um, for Renault, then, the great promise of America could not be fulfilled without the abolition of slavery, but between her potential mission for saving the world and her actual state of corruption, there was an immeasurable gap. Such a view of the American dilemma carries overtones of the traditional Christian conception of man's condition as a sinner potentially capable of regeneration. Yet Renault had no faith in the power of Christianity to remove Americans' burden of sin, since the Church had openly tolerated the worst forms of cruelty and inhumanity. His faith in the effectiveness of reason was only slightly greater, though he took the trouble of suggesting a rational plan of emancipation to the rulers of Europe. But to talk to slave holders of the superiority of free labor was like relying on rational persuasion to convert hardened sinners. Were there, we might ask, any inherent forces at work in America that would lead to the eradication of slavery and thus free the land for its providential mission? Was slavery in America only a historical accident, or was it part of the essential being of the New World? Renault gave no definite answers, but he had not acknowledged that in the ancient world slavery had coexisted with prosperity, republican government, and advancing civilization. It had been unaffected by Christianity and had come to an end in Europe only when economic and political conditions were favorable to freedom. It had been associated with the development of America from the first Spanish settlements. Renault seemed to suggest that slavery was intrinsic to America, such much as Orthodox theology has contributed original sin to be intrinsic to man's nature. He indicated that its end would come only through some cataclysmic upheaval, such as a rebellion of the slaves led by a black Spartacus, who would be a vehicle for nature asserting her rights against the blind avarice of European and American colonists. The good philosophies philosophes enthusiasm is such a blood atonement showed his lack of faith in any indwelling force for gradual freedom and peaceful salvation. America could not fulfill her promise to mankind without agony. Okay, that's page 17 out of 28 for this chapter. So I am gonna take a very quick break though, where there's a good break uh, in in the chapter, just because that is tiny, tiny text. Um, I may end up having to get some cheaters to be able to read that properly. But I will take a quick break. I'll be back in just a few minutes, and we'll finish out the chapter. got to turn my mic on, don't I? Um, all right, so I found my cheaters. When the Abbé Raynal raised these disturbing questions, Negro slavery extended through most of the settled provinces of the Western Hemisphere, and the slave trade flourished without restraint. Almost 80 years later, when Henri Wallon wrote his 3-volume Histoire de l'esclavage dans l'Antiquité, um, slavery had been abolished in Canada, the British West Indies, Haiti, Mexico, Central America, and many of the independent countries of South America. It had virtually disappeared from the northern section of the United States, and Wallon could assume that Negroes would soon be emancipated in the French West Indies. The Atlantic slave trade, while far from dead, was officially condemned by all civilized nations. American slavery survived as a vital institution only in Cuba, Brazil, and the southern United States. Wallon's work on ancient slavery, which was to have considerable influence on subsequent historical writing, reflected many of the values and assumptions of the international anti-slavery movement of the mid 19th century, much as the Histoire du Indies epitomized the anti-slavery thought of the philosophes. In a lengthy introduction, he pointed to the connection between ancient and modern servitude, and placed a contemporary problem within the context of historical progress resulting from the spread and influence of Christianity. Wallon had far greater faith than Raynal in the power of moral truth to guide the course of history. Since slavery violated eternal moral laws, it was always wrong and could never be a necessary condition of historical development. The struggle between liberty and bondage was as old as human society. Why then had slavery persisted so long? I'm just going to say Wayland. It's easier. Wayland took pains to refute the pro-slavery theorists who argued that what was accepted in antiquity should be at least condoned in the 19th century. Slavery in the ancient world had rested on the supremacy of force over moral sensibility. Despite a common recognition that bondage was an unnatural and unsatisfying condition, there had been no moral influence to overcome the specious arguments of Aristotle, who had confused nature with the actual institutions of the city-state and had provided sophisms for all future apologists for slavery. Even the Stoic conception of freedom had led only to an indifference toward man's external conditions. Wayland associated slavery from all that was good. Oh, sorry. Wayland dissociated slavery from all that was good or admirable in antiquity. It was the radical flaw which had led to the decay of the Greek city-states and to the corruption of Rome. But the introduction of Christianity had brought a profound transformation to the slave-burdened world. The doubts of philosophers had finally been answered by the revealed word that all men are equal before God. While the Church had accepted the hierarchy of ranks in society, it had expressed solicitude for the slave and had charged masters with the duty of treating their servants as brothers in Christ. After slowly softening the harsh laws and manners of the Roman world, Christianity had improved the condition of slaves until, gently and almost imperceptibly, they had entered a state of freedom. This widely accepted view of European emancipation conformed with a faith in progress and an aversion to abrupt, revolutionary changes, but it raised perplexing questions with respect to America. As Wayland recognized, his theory implied that the restoration of slavery that accompanied the settlement of America was not only an act of violence against the spirit of the gospel, but a brusque departure from the normal development of humanity. The inescapable conclusion seemed to be that America was an accidental or extraneous force which led to a retrogression from the providential course of moral progress. Whalen suggested that the settlement of the New World had provided a small group of selfish merchants and planters with an opportunity to derail the train of historical progress. Accordingly, it was necessary for reformers supported by an enlightened public to get the train back on the track. Raynal had considered slavery and the natural order to be mutually exclusive, even though slavery seemed to have been an intrinsic part of the New World history. Whalen held that it was slavery and the progress of Christianity that were mutually exclusive, a view which was shared by many fellow abolitionists. Like Raynal, he perceived a contradiction between human bondage and a system of fundamental values, but his interpretation was even less successful in clarifying the problem of slavery in America. It presupposed a kind of idealistic teleology, since history was conceived as a gradual realization of Christian principles. Retrogressions were explained by reference to a few evil groups who unaccountably gained sufficient power to thwart the tide of progress. Whalen evaded the question whether slavery had played an essential function in various periods of history, and he seemed to reverse the traditional view of America as a liberating force and stimulus to human progress. 6 years before the publication of the Histoire de l'esclavage, Auguste Comte sought to give a scientific explanation of human slavery and reached conclusions which in some respects were remarkably similar to Whalen's. He greatly simplified the problem of ancient slavery by abandoning the concept of universal moral standards. Unlike Raynal and Whalen, he saw no absolute contradiction between slavery and nature or slavery and Christianity. Indeed, for Comte, human bondage had served an indispensable function in the progress of civilization, since it had replaced cannibalism and human sacrifice and had enforced the discipline of sustained and regular work on men who would otherwise have been ruled by the most immediate passion or desire. Such arguments could, of course, be used to justify the enslavement of primitive peoples. Comte himself found profound meaning in Aristotle's theory that some men are slaves by nature. But Comte's philosophic system rested on a rigidly prescribed series of ascending stages of history. If slavery was a normal institution in a polytheistic society, it became a useless vestige as society progressed through monotheistic and metaphysical stages. By the 19th century, it was a monstrous aberration. It reversed the course of progress and prevented the extension of those general scientific principles that were necessary for the emergence of a rational society. In Africa, slavery might well contribute to the progress of the Negroes, as it had contributed to the progress of ancient societies, but enslavement of primitive peoples by more advanced nations interfered with the laws of history and disrupted the whole scheme of gradual progress. Thus, Comte substituted a theory of historical stages for the traditional dualism of worldly evil and immutable higher law, and in the end he agreed with Whalen that slaveholders were pitting themselves against the stream of history. If the institution were not doomed by the eternal principles of nature or by the spread of Christianity, its fate was sealed by the laws of positivistic science. Yet how had this quote-unquote disgraceful anomaly come into being, and how was it related to the meaning of the New World? Comte was not particularly troubled by the latter question, since America played no important function in his theory of historical progress. Protestantism, in his eyes, had led the English colonies in a path contrary to that prescribed by science. The American Revolution was something of an anachronism. To be sure, the Catholic Church, which had originally helped to emancipate Europe, had in its decadence sanctioned and promoted colonial slavery. Yet even a debilitated Catholicism tended to mitigate the worst evils of human bondage, whereas the spiritual anarchy of the Protestant colonies left the way open to unlimited private oppression. Comte's institutional approach had much in common with later studies in comparative slavery, but without the trappings of teleological history. His arguments could easily be turned to a defense of servitude as an institution performing necessary functions of discipline and socialization. This was, in effect, the approach of many of the quote unquote scientific historians of the early 20th century. What? What? Oh, we got a ways to go. The European thinkers we have discussed thus far had somewhat ambivalent views on the moral influence of the New World. George Bancroft, the most popular and nationalistic of early American historians, had not the slightest doubt that the influence had been all for the good. Limiting himself to the area included in the United States, he set out to explain how in only 2 centuries the happiest and most enlightened civilization in history had arisen from the wilderness to become a model for the rest of the world. But when he grappled with the problem of slavery, how it was related to the American mission, whether it was integral to American development, and whether its extension to the New World was a retrogression from the course of progress, he resorted to a curious mixture of assumptions which reflected inconsistencies prevalent in American thought from late colonial times to the 20th century. As a loyal Democrat and patriotic American writing at a time when his party supported the expansion of slave territory, Bancroft went out of his way to emphasize the antiquity and universality of an institution which, one might conclude, was not so peculiar after all. Unlike Wayland, he found no continuing contest between liberty and bondage in the ancient world. Quote, in every Grecian republic, slavery was an indispensable element, end quote. Nor was the practice wholly incompatible with virtue and religion, for quote, the light that broke from Sinai scattered the corrupting illusions of polytheism, but slavery planted itself even in the promised land on the banks of Siloah near the oracles of God. End quote. It was true that the extreme harshness of the Roman slave law had hastened the empire's fall, but Bancroft's picture of the ancient world suggested that slavery might be planted in other promised lands without blighting their mission. He adopted, however, the conventional view of Christianity slowly sapping the foundations of bondage in Europe. If slavery had not detracted from the splendor of Grecian republics, it was still incompatible with human progress, and would have disappeared entirely among civilized nations had not an outside force intervened. In Bancroft's eyes, this outside force was not America, but the continuing wars between Islam and Christianity, which had nourished bigotry and revenge. Angered by the raids of Saracen corsairs, Christians had felt justified in capturing any Moor they could lay hands upon, and they had classified all Africans as Moors. In any event, the Negroes themselves had always accepted slavery, and when the Portuguese had commenced trading along the western coast of Africa, they had simply appropriated a commercial system which the Moors of the north had established centuries before. Bancroft admitted that the Portuguese were guilty of mercantile cupidity, but in a certain sense it was Africa that had corrupted Europe. The Spanish, who had also been brutalized by wars with the Muslims, had endeavored to enslave the Indians, or as Bancroft called them, the quote unquote free men of the wilderness. Even Columbus had participated in this unnatural act, though such a lapse was presumably redeemed by his contribution to the advance of liberty, and as Washington Irving had said, quote, the customs of the times must be pleaded in his apology. End quote. Slavery, however, was totally alien to American soil, and in order to rivet the system, actually, it wasn't. He's not taking into account yet that Native Americans kept slaves too. But anyway, slavery, however, was totally alien to American soil, and in order to rivet the system on their colonies, the Spanish had been forced to import a more docile and submissive race. The significant point about Bancroft's interpretation is that he considered slavery basically extraneous to the New World and contrary to the natural development of Europe. It was thus a kind of abnormal excrescence which had been fastened on America by Europeans whose avarice and brutality had been stimulated by their contact with Africa. When Bancroft turned to the founding of the North American colonies, he underscored the fundamental conflict between slavery and the very meaning of the New World. Quote, "While Virginia," he wrote, "by the concession of a Republican government was constituted the asylum of liberty, by one of the strange contradictions in human affairs it became the abode of hereditary bondsmen." End quote. Monarchy, aristocracy, and priestcraft had no motive to cross the Atlantic. Quote, "Nothing came from Europe but a free people, the people separating itself from all other elements of previous civilization, the people self-confiding and industrious, the people wise by all traditions that favored popular happiness. The people alone broke away from European influence and in the New World laid the foundation of our republic." End quote. As part of this classic picture of American innocence and separateness, Bancroft stressed the original and deep antipathy that the people felt for slavery. His argument that slavery was essentially foreign to America appeared to stumble a bit when, discussing South Carolina, he seemed to adopt Montesquieu's belief in the primacy of climate. He even asserted that the contrast between Carolina and New York was due to climate and not to the superior humanity of the original Dutch colonists. Yet he thought that the people and legislation of every colony had favored freedom, and that Massachusetts especially had opposed the introduction of slaves from the beginning. In Rhode Island, if Providence and Warwick had failed to enforce their law of 1652 against slavery, quote, "the principle lived among the people." End quote. How then could one account for the survival and growth of an institution so repugnant to the desires of a free people? Bancroft's answer was one which Americans had long resorted to. It was founded on a sharp moral distinction between the original cause of American slavery, the selfish greed of European merchants and governments, and the conditions which led to its perpetuation. If the type of servitude fastened on America had been the same as that which Europeans had long endured, the problem would soon have been solved, quote, "by the benevolent spirit of colonial legislation." End quote. But from the beginning, America had been plagued with racial incompatibility. Quote, "The Negro race from the first was regarded with disgust, and its union with the whites forbidden under ignominious penalties." End quote. Thus, racial dissimilarity could be offered as an excuse for laws and practices which simply had the best of an unfortunate situation. And when Bancroft took a larger perspective, he had to admit that America's burden was not, after all, without its rewards. In his native continent, the African would have remained in, quote, "unproductive servitude." End quote. In America, at least, his labor contributed greatly to the wealth of nations. Adopting for the moment one of the favorite theories of Southern apologists, Bancroft concluded that, quote, "in the midst of the horrors of slavery and the slave trade, the masters had, in part at least, performed the office of advancing and civilizing the Negro." End quote. While Bancroft saw a basic contradiction between slavery and America's mission, he resolved the dilemma in a manner that was apparently satisfactory to most of his countrymen. The institution was alien to the true nature of the New World. It had been imposed on the people against their will, and the guilt thus fell upon an already guilt-sickened Europe. Yet, in a large view, even slavery appeared as part of the providential plan for the redemption of the human race. In Bancroft's eyes, the first ship that brought Negroes to America was a sure pledge that in due time ships from the New World would carry the blessings of Christianity to Africa. Even selfishness and injustice had a role to play in the historical unfolding of truth and liberty. Americans could comfort themselves with the thought that Negro slavery, a vestige of Old World corruption, was only a temporary irritant which would gradually disappear under the beneficent pressure of democratic institutions. The history of the slavery controversy in the United States well testifies that Bancroft was not alone in his optimistic belief. We have suggested that Negro slavery, a product of innumerable decisions of self-interest, made by traders and princes in Europe and Africa, was an intrinsic part of American development from the first discoveries. The evolution of the institution was also coeval with the creation of the idea of America as a new beginning, a land of promise where men's hopes and aspirations would find fulfillment. The dreams and ideals embodied in various images of the New World would not necessarily conflict with the enslavement of a foreign people unless there were already tensions over slavery in the system of values which Europeans applied to America. That there were such tensions remains to be shown. For the moment, it will suffice if we note that the problem of slavery in the New World could be conceptualized as part of a general conflict between ideals and reality in the course of human history. Thus, the Abbé Raynal hinted that the discrepancy between natural law and colonial slavery was so great that revolution might be necessary to bring the ideal and reality of America into harmony. For Henry Wayland and Auguste Comte, America itself was something of an anomaly since it represented a disturbing retrogression from the course of historical progress. Yet Wayland's faith in the power of Christianity and Comte's confidence in the inexorable laws of history led them to expect the imminent triumph of freedom. To some extent, all three of these thinkers associated the paradox of modern slavery with America itself, but to George Bancroft, servitude was fundamentally extrinsic to the New World, whose very meaning lay in the emancipation of mankind. Although Bancroft recognized that the Negro had played a vital part in the founding of certain colonies, he felt that slavery was so contrary to America's destiny that it would evaporate from the sheer heat of triumphant democracy. Okay, getting there. Each of these writers, like an increasing number of men on both sides of the Atlantic, saw modern slavery as a moral contradiction, as a force incompatible with natural law, Christianity, the progress of scientific enlightenment, or the mission of American democracy. We may feel that the growth of such anti-slavery opinion was itself evidence of moral progress, but the very recognition of slavery as a moral contradiction raised perplexing questions concerning the history of the institution and the sources of anti-slavery thought. 19th century writers tended to exaggerate the historical opposition between slavery and Christianity, to disregard the crucial economic function of slavery in American development, and to read history as a struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness, a struggle whose outcome had fortunately been decided beforehand by the great contriver of events. In the cosmic view of Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example, the emancipation of slaves in the British West Indies was, quote, an event singular in the history of civilization, a day of reason, of the clear light, of that which makes us better than a flock of birds and beasts, a day which gave the immense fortification of a fact of gross history to ethical abstraction, end quote. It was true, Emerson conceded, that the British moral sense had been supported by self-interest and material advantage. Quote, else I know not how in our world any good would ever get done, end quote. The British knew that slavery, quote, slavery does not love the whistle of the railroad, it does not love the newspaper, the mailbag, a college, a book, or a preacher who has the absurd whim of saying what he thinks, end quote. But if England was a nation of calculating shopkeepers, this only made emancipation of the more sublime. In an age of smoking factories and money grubbing, it was a stately spectacle. During the epic conflict, all that was wise, noble, and generous had been arrayed against the cramped and mean elements of life. Emerson noted that, quote, other revolutions have been the insurrection of the oppressed. This was the repentance of the tyrant, end quote. Thus, British emancipation was both proof of moral progress in history and the harbinger of a new era when the masses would awaken and apply an absolute moral standard to every public question. Quote, the power that built this fabric of things, Emerson concluded, has made a sign to the ages of his will. I had to get some water in me. The persuasive force of this optimistic view can be seen in its adoption on a far more sophisticated level by Alfred North Whitehead, who used emancipation as an example of the compelling force of moral ideas in the progress of civilization. The history of ideas, he held, was a history of mistakes. Quote, but through all mistakes it is also the history of the gradual purification of conduct. End quote. This could be seen in the slow and tortuous evolution of Plato's doctrine of the human soul, which was the ultimate source of the anti-slavery movement. Centuries of rationalizations and social obstacles had repressed the inherent conflict between ancient slavery and Plato's vision of what man can be. Yet general ideas were always a danger to the existing order, and as civilization progressed, as Greek and Hebrew glimpses of perfection acquired new force in the Enlightenment and Wesleyan revival, slavery was doomed. Whitehead avoided the common error of supposing that men in one generation are endowed with greater moral insight than those in another, but he was by no means clear on what the quote-unquote conditions were that gave a cutting edge to Plato's doctrine, and his theory seemed to rest on an assumption that historical progress is a result of the gradual realization of general ideas. The great virtue of such interpretations is that they recognize slavery as a genuine moral problem and attach importance to moral values as an element in history. Historians who ignore conflicts in moral value or who attempt to reduce to other categories of explanation moral questions that have an autonomy of their own can be justly charged with blindness to the facts of life as we experience it. Yet even Whitehead was writing in a happy era when he could say with confidence that anti-slavery reformers, quote, had produced the final effective force which hereafter made slavery impossible among progressive races, end quote. Belief in the certainty of moral progress is a matter of personal faith. But in the second half of the 20th century, historians have been less inclined to assume that we have been moving irresistibly toward a golden age. Recognition that slavery in America involved a genuine moral problem does not require us to believe that emancipation was preordained by the progressive unfolding of moral truth, or that men in the 19th century were morally superior to those in periods when slavery was universally accepted, or that in the contest between slaveholders and abolitionists, all virtue and reasonableness were on one side. Let me sip some water here. In recent decades, historians have been less content with theories of progressive currents washing away the dregs of an evil past. Certain skeptics and reductionists have portrayed the entire slavery controversy in terms of contending economic interests, holding that the institution was supported as long as it was profitable to a given group or nation, and was repudiated only when it ceased to pay. As we have seen, Emerson recognized the economic motive in British emancipation, but the role of the abolitionist was protected by his transcendental scheme of progress. 20th century historians have not been so charitable. They have told us that if the reformers were not hypocrites or a front for economic interests, they were perhaps a displaced elite who sought to retain power and status by mobilizing public opinion. Such lines of investigation, when cautiously pursued, have brought rewarding insights into the relations between ideology and social structure. But while these newer approaches have revealed weaknesses in the traditional teleological view of the anti slavery crusade, they have tended to divert attention from the fact that Negro slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries posed a genuine moral problem that reflected deep tensions in Western culture and involved the very meaning of America. And that is the end of the chapter. Um, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there, but I don't really have anything to comment at the moment. I am interested in seeing where he goes with it. Um, he's mentioned a couple of things, but just in passing, and I'm hoping he gets into them later on. One was he mentioned that slavery was already going on in Africa, and it just shifted focus to exportation of slaves when the Portuguese and Spanish showed up and wanted to buy slaves, and the Muslims wanted to buy slaves. So it's good that he mentioned that way back in 1966. And there was another thing I noticed that came up recently. What was it? He still never mentioned that the Native Americans held slaves, and he hasn't yet mentioned indentured servitude of Europeans, especially Irish and I think Italians. I may be wrong on the Italians, but especially the Irish were indentured servants. And a lot of the Chinese were too. When they were building the railroads, they were brought over. The price of their passage over to America was their indentured servitude. They sold themselves into servitude and worked it off once they got here, and that was the deal. And a lot of people got to America that way. So yes, it's only a temporary slavery, but it's still slavery. Okay, and um, the next chapter actually is patterns of continuity in the history of servitude. So that should be interesting. We'll get into that on Sunday. Um, we'll get in. I'm only going to be able to handle one chapter a night in this book. It's a heavy read, I think. I think you can tell. So that will be that for this session. I'm going to end it. Um, yeah, indentured servants were worth less. They were cheaper and more expendable, um, especially where you could go get a whole ship of Chinese indentured servants and bring them over and put them to work in the on the railroads or in the mine or whatever, and it was dangerous work, and deadly work, and they could very easily. It was worth bringing them over. I lost my train of thought there. Anyway, I'm done. I'm going to end this session and do a little gaming here in just a few minutes. So I will see you later.
Die.